Hello, my name is Laura Tillotson and I am the Diva in Spirit, here to take you on a journey of all things fermented and distilled, and of course, all the wonderful ways to enjoy them. Today we are continuing our home bar series and starting to really focus in on each of those Honey, I'm Home cocktails, beginning today with the most famous, the most iconic cocktail in the history of the word, the Martini. We're going to talk a little bit about its history and its evolution, and we're going to learn how to make one and how to order it. So the history of that cocktail is actually kind of long and complicated. The Martini cocktail, those words, first appear in a bartender's manual in 1888. But the cocktail itself actually goes back even a little bit further than that. There are several different legends that all kind of swirl and coalesce around each other, but it kind of centers around two different stories that I think both incorporate the truth. So the first is that the Martini is an evolution of another cocktail called the Martinez. The Martinez is itself a variation on the Manhattan, but instead of using whiskey with sweet vermouth, the Martinez used Old Tom gin. On another day, we're going to go deep into the history of gin and really talk about Old Tom, but what you need to know today is that Old Tom gin is a sweeter style of gin that was immensely popular at the end of the 18th century and the outset of cocktail culture. So the Martinez cocktail, about half and half gin and sweet vermouth, a couple of other things, but this is that main cocktail that starts gaining some popularity. And here's where the second part of the story comes in. Martini and Rossi was the first vermouth to be widely distributed and therefore gain popularity in the United States. So when you're making your Martinez cocktail, you're reaching for that Martini and Rossi vermouth. In reaching over and over for Martini vermouth, this became known as the Martini cocktail. Now, up until this point, we're mostly talking about still sweet vermouth alongside our gin. A couple of things happened at the beginning of the 20th century that start to change the trajectory, evolve that cocktail into what we know today. First of all, Old Tom gin starts to lose popularity in favor of this new style, London Dry. London Dry gin is what we know of as gin today. That classic, clean, crisp, juniper forward, super herbaceous, your Beefeater, your Tanqueray, your Plymouth. These are London Dry gins. This is what we think of as gin today. As that became popular, that's what we started drinking here. And instead of sweet vermouth, bartenders started reaching for dry vermouth to pair with that wonderful dry gin. The other very important thing that happens beginning of 20th century is, of course, prohibition. Ironically, banning all alcohol in the United States led to an incredible surge in popularity, especially of gin. It was much easier to make than other distilled spirits like whiskey, but also the botanicals that are integral to gin began to mask the flavor of truly unpleasant homemade spirits. So gin is what was flowing freely in all of those speakeasies and all of those underground drinking lounges. They drank gin, and to further mask the rather unpleasant taste of homemade bathtub gin, they made cocktails. Specifically, they were making martinis. Specifically, they were starting to make dry martinis. And this really establishes the Martini as the cocktail of the United States through the 20th century. Through most of the 20th century, both the sweet and dry variations still had their place. So much so that when you sat down at a bar, ordered your martini, the bartender would immediately ask you sweet or dry. Through the end of the 20th century, the answer was just always dry. Nobody drank sweet martinis. They fell completely out of fashion, so much so that today they don't even bother asking you anymore. They assume what you want is a dry martini. Another very important evolution happened last half of the 20th century with the creation of an incredibly iconic character, James Bond. Ian Fleming gave us the rise in popularity of the vodka martini. So by the end of the 20th century to today, you are as likely to see a vodka martini as you are a gin. They're both incredibly popular, incredibly valid, and very delicious cocktails. So let's talk about how to make our classic martini. Before we start mixing ingredients, I want to do a quick cocktail 101. As we talked about last week, all cocktails are going to begin in a shaker. We're going to build all of our ingredients. We are going to use our jigger to measure them. I strongly recommend you put your ingredients in your shaker and then add the ice. You want to add the ice last because you want it to spend as little time as possible in your spirit, because it's going to water it down. It's going to dilute your cocktail. Nobody wants that. So we go ingredients, then ice, and then we either stir or we shake. This is another big debate. The very short answer is you should only shake a cocktail when you are incorporating juice. It needs a little bit of extra vigor. But when we're talking about spirit-forward cocktails like the Martini, like the Manhattan, the Old Fashioned, etc., you always want to stir, never shake, especially when we're talking about gin. You've probably heard the term bruising your gin before. What does that mean? So first off, in shaking, tiny little ice chips begin to break up because of the vigor of shaking it against the metal. Those ice chips are going to melt and of course further dilute your cocktail. So that's part one. But even more importantly, when you shake the cocktail, you are actually completely changing the molecular structure of the spirit. That means that all of the aromatics get lost. You're going to lose the juniper, you lose the black pepper, you lose the coriander, the orange peel, all of those wonderful aromatic compounds that make gin gin will literally disappear into the air when you shake it. And that is why when we're making a gin martini, always stir, never shake. With vodka, less important. Vodka, the only thing you're really worrying about is diluting your cocktail. I still don't think that's a great idea. So if you need your cocktail to be ice cold, just keep your spirits in the freezer, and that way it's going to be the temperature that you want it to be without having to break your cocktail in order to make it. Now, let's start assembling our ingredients. So classic recipe for your standard martini is going to be approximately 3 ounces of your base spirit to 1 ounce of vermouth. So that's where we're going to start today. I'm using gin. A word about this gin, it is blue. It's not just the bottle. One of the botanicals in this particular gin is actually butterfly pea flower, which is bright blue, hence my gin being bright blue. So my shaker top here, again, measures up to 2 ounces, but I've also got lines to measure out just 1 ounce. So we've done that to make our 3 ounces of gin. Now I'm going to take my vermouth, and we're going to add 1 ounce of vermouth. Now we're going to add some ice. Carefully so we don't splash. And I'm going to take my bar spoon. We're going to very vigorously stir. You want to stir until frost begins to develop on the outside of your shaker. You can also just kind of hang on to it at the bottom here, and it's going to get so cold that it's hard to hold on to. Just keep stirring until you get there. Usually about 30 seconds or so. And now, take our chilled martini glass, put that strainer lid back on so we don't spill the ice, and drain. Look how pretty that is. I mean, it's delicious gin. It really is a delicious gin, but I just love how pretty it is. Now, when you're garnishing your martini, you can either use olives or a twist. I'm going to use a twist. That's my preference for a standard martini. We're going to take our vegetable peeler here. There we go. And to really get all of the wonderful citrus flavor out of this, we are actually going to twist it over the glass. That's going to express all of the oils. Maybe run it just around the glass, get a little bit of extra, and then drop that in. And voila. Cheers. That's delicious. So when you're ordering your martini, if you sit down at the bar and you order a martini, don't say the word dry. Just say, I want a martini. Your bartender knows that you want a dry martini. When you say the word dry to your bartender, that sends the message that we want less vermouth. So if you want less vermouth, that's fine. But know that that's what you're communicating. So play with your ratios at home. Decide what works for you. If we like this 3-to-1, but you think it's maybe a little more vermouth than you want, dial it back to a 1/2 ounce. Dial it back to a 1/4 ounce. Maybe you decide you don't want any vermouth at all. That is also fine. But know that that is no longer a martini. If you don't want any vermouth at all, just tell your bartender you want Hendrick's up with a twist. They're going to give you what you want. When you tell your bartender you want a dry martini, they're going to decrease the amount of vermouth that's in that cocktail. So we're going to go from 1 ounce to a 1/2 ounce, maybe a 1/4 ounce. If you know that what you want is a 1/4 ounce of vodka, 1/4 ounce of vermouth to your vodka, tell your bartender that. They're going to make it this way. If you really enjoy the flavor of the vermouth, dial it up. Do a wet martini, and that goes back to that 1/2 and 1/2 ratio that was the origin of the cocktail. You can also do a reverse martini where we literally flip the ratio and you're going to get 3 ounces of vermouth to only 1 ounce of either vodka or gin. So these are the standard ways to order your martini. Next week, we're going to talk about some fun variations. We're going to talk about the Vesper, we're going to talk about the dirty martini and the perfect martini. Lots of fun ways to play with these standard ingredients and create all new cocktails. So in the meantime, please make sure that you follow me on Instagram and on Facebook. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. And until then, I will be with you in spirit.